morning, we're starting a brand new series that we're calling How to Have Those Really, Really, Really Difficult Conversations. And sometimes, for us to have authentic relationships, we need to have difficult conversations. Bill Hybels, who's a famous pastor in Chicago of Willow Creek, one of the largest churches in the United States, wrote in a book one time, and he talked about when you're traveling to the ski slopes from Denver, you've got to go through this long tunnel. And it's this long, dark tunnel that you think is never going to end. And then you get back to the end of the tunnel, and it just opens up in this gorgeous valley with these mountain views. And he said something that struck me. He said, relationships are like that. That sometimes you've got to go through long, dark tunnels to get to the place that God really ultimately wants you to be. We got to have tough conversations. We've got to go through tough times. We've got to speak the truth in love. But at the end of the tunnel, we find that we have more authentic, deeper, building kinds of relationships. Romans chapter 12, verse 18 says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And our society really has adopted this as kind of a principle for our lives, that people don't want to have any kind of conflict or any kind of argument. In fact, we shy away a little bit from speaking the truth in favor of just being as grace-oriented and permissible towards as many people as we possibly can. But the Bible really asks us to speak the truth in love. And sometimes it means we've got to have these difficult conversations. Probably like me, it's at kind of early on in life. My mom used to make these signature dishes, and it doesn't take a whole lot to keep me happy. A little macaroni and cheese, a hot dog, grilled cheese, anything like that. But then she got the dreaded Betty Crocker cookbook. And so she'd yank that thing out, and she would pull together, these crazy different dishes. Some of them were good. Some of them were not that good. And she would always ask me, she's looking at me, and of course she probably slaved over the stove all day long, and she's having me feed this, she's feeding me this new Brussels sprout recipe, and she asked me, do you like it? And I know that by the way she's looking at me, she's really asking, do you like me? You ever felt that way? And you don't know what to say. Do I tell the truth that I really don't like it that much? Or do I just sit here in silence and keep nibbling on this food that I really don't like all that much? Early on, we're kind of confronted with feeling like we're between a rock and a hard place through some of these difficult conversations. We often choose either silence or violence. Sometimes we're just chasing after one another yelling, and sometimes we're just shutting down. Patrick Lencioni talks about these difficult conversations in boardrooms. One time they did a 360 evaluation where employees have the opportunity to evaluate their supervisor. And so they were in this boardroom. The CEO was there with all of his direct reports who were managers within the company. And the CEO pulled this out and says, well, I guess we got to go through it. And Lencioni's sitting in the corner, and he says, well, it says here that I have difficulty receiving any kind of criticism. I thought I was doing a lot better at that. What do you think, Bob? No, I think you're doing great. Bob just throws everybody under the bus. And he goes right around the table, and to a person, everybody says, no, you're doing fantastic. You're doing amazing. You receive criticism just fine. Don't worry about it. And Lencioni, in a way that only he can, he kind of shuffles up to the table and says, listen, the only ones who did this 360 evaluation were the people around this table. It says that the CEO has difficult receiving criticism because people indicated that on their evaluation sheets. Somebody is not telling the truth. And a lot of times in situations like that, and you may have had this in your business, you feel like you need to salute or go mute, right? And you just don't know how to handle it. You don't know what to do. You're stuck in that kind of place between how do I be 100% honest and at the same time 100% respectful? How do I speak the truth and yet 100% accept this person? How do I reject the behavior but love this person? And it's always tough to do. And many times people just run away from it. I had this lady come to me one time, and she was having difficulty in her marriage, and she started talking about her husband, and he does this, and he's so disrespectful, and he's so embarrassing, he's messy at home, he yells, it's just not working in our relationship. And I said, oh, well, how did he respond as you're talking to him about some of this stuff? And she just looked at me really sheepishly, and she put her head down, and she says, well, actually, that's why I'm here. Because I was hoping you could talk to him. You know, we want to pass off the responsibility of having these difficult conversations to somebody else. And this hits at every point in our life. You know, many times you need to break up from a relationship, you know, a dating relationship, a boyfriend, a girlfriend. You know the relationship isn't right, but you don't want to hurt their feelings, and so you just kind of keep going through the motions of the relationship. I've actually seen people go ahead and get married simply because they don't want to hurt this person's feelings. They're so scared of having these difficult conversations. You may be asking a friend to repay a loan, or dealing with a rebellious teenager, or confronting a loved one about a substance abuse problem, or asking your in-laws to quit interfering. I mean, this is part of life. And you can't have healthy families, you can't have healthy marriages, you can't have healthy friendships, and you certainly can't have a healthy church unless everybody commits to going through this tunnel of chaos and sometimes having very, very difficult conversations. Difficult conversations keep us connected. Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the Sermon on the Mount a little bit later, but it says, Jesus says this, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there at the altar and first go and be reconciled to them, and then come back and offer your gift. You know, our relationship with one another and the depth of our relationship with one another says a lot about our relationship with God. That God cares so much about us that he wants us to walk in fresh, dynamic, authentic, deep relationships that build one another up. He wants us to be connected, and that requires difficult relationships. Difficult conversations. Difficult conversations help us to grow. Ephesians 4:15. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every aspect or every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. Meaning, oftentimes when we have these difficult conversations and the frictions and tensions that sometimes we go through, God uses these conversations to help us become more and more and more Christ-like. It's the way that we embrace spiritual maturity. Difficult conversations keep us from sin. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rather, rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share in their guilt. Don't harbor anger in your heart. You know, it's interesting when we refuse to have difficult conversations where we're speaking the truth in love. Many times what happens is suddenly we start to harbor resentment in our heart. And that resentment slowly turns to bitterness. That bitterness slowly turns to anger. It could even lead us to gossiping about that person, where we turn to a third party who's not even involved and begin to malign the person that we have this resentment towards. Difficult conversations and committing to speak the truth in love keep us from harboring that sinful attitude even in our own heart. And so we're going to look at kind of Jesus' launch into public ministry. It was a Sermon on the Mount. He's standing on a hillside. There's no PA system or sound system to address the people, so he would stand upon the mountainside and address crowds and multitudes of people. Many times it could have been thousands of people. Towards the latter part of this particular sermon that's recorded in Matthew chapter 7, he addresses something that is absolutely so pivotal to us before we have these difficult conversations. And we're going to do, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the pre-work that we need to do in order to engage in these difficult conversations. But Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 7. He says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." This particular verse in the Bible, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged," has recently eclipsed what used to be the most famous verse in the Bible. The most famous verse in the Bible previously was John 3:16. But now, everyone in our society is repeating this verse, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." And it's interesting when we look at that, we say, well, maybe God doesn't want us to have these difficult conversations at all. We just simply shouldn't judge anybody's behavior. But let's keep reading a little bit further to see the context of what Jesus is talking about. Because just a few verses later, Jesus says this, "By their fruit, you will recognize them. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them." And so right away, Jesus is inviting us to judge the fruit of someone's life, to judge their actions and behaviors, to see what their motivations truly are. And so I think within the context of what he's talking about, he's saying don't judge others with a different measuring rod than you judge yourself. You know, many times we want to hold somebody else to a much higher standard than we ourselves are held to. And he's saying with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. When you judge somebody else by a certain standard, well, you're inviting them to judge you by that same standard. He goes on to say this in verse 3. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Thanks to a buddy of mine who brought this morning, I happen to have a plank. And you can look at this. I mean, this is kind of the language Jesus is using. He's saying, you know what? You're trying to take this speck out of someone else's eye, but you're walking around with this huge board sticking out of your head. And you may think no one sees it, but everyone can see it. And you know, if I wanted to take this out of my eye, I would have to get 5 guys, and we'd have to forcefully pull it out of my head, right? And it would probably do a lot of damage. But this is pretty obvious. It requires no level of gentleness at all. It just needs to be forcefully removed as early as possible. Conversely, if I was going to take a speck out of someone's eye, I might use a pair of tweezers like this. And I'm going to go up as gently as I possibly can and take that speck of sawdust out of their eye. And what if we approached one another in relationships a little bit like that? That in regards to our own faults and the plank out of our eye, that we did everything possibly to forcefully remove that, to get rid of it. But with the faults of other people, we acted so very gently. Paul said in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, he says, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person," what? Gently. "But watch yourself, or you also will be tempted." What he's saying is, don't do it so gently that you just avoid those conversations altogether, because again, then you open your own heart and life up to a sinful attitude. And so let's unpack this a little bit. He says, first, remove the plank from your own eye. Psalm 18, verse 27 says, "You save the humble, but bring low the eyes of the haughty." And there's something about the pride of life that begins to afflict our own heart. Many times when we're